Welcome to this Lead in 3D alignment session. Happy new moon. Welcome to our 3D leaders live and watching after the fact. I'm now 3D for people who don't know me. I've been working for, well, really like 30 plus years, but working as a paid professional for about 20 years on what I call having my all, right? So the lesson is we can't have it all. I used to have fabulous dance parties with my dad, and we listened to the Rolling Stones, and he would, in each dance party, play me, "You can't always get what you want," which is a fabulous dad message, but also a really important leadership message. And it is from that this idea of leading in 3D has come, which means doing things with our time, attention, and energy that advance goals in 3 dimensions. For me, my holistic well being, for we, the performance of our teams, our companies, and our families, and the world, the broader communities or causes, whatever it is that we care most about. And so we gather in all kinds of ways, including on new and full moons, with brilliant, fabulous 3D leaders who are generous with their time and their reflections. And so for that, Sheema is with us today. The theme is inertia in the community in this month. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm curious if folks, if you want to just type like a 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, do you feel zero inertia? Everything is literally burning and changing so fast right now, maybe, or 10, totally frozen and stuck, or maybe somewhere in the middle. And we'll dive in and talk more about that live. Sheema and I met almost a year ago via Defy Ventures, which is an incredible nonprofit that works with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated humans. So we met in prison, York Correctional in Connecticut, which is everything from low to very high top security women's institution. Just published a piece on them. It's Second Chance Month. Who knew? In April. I didn't know that. And so just published a piece about them. And if people are interested in volunteering, I cannot recommend it enough. Sheema also went to Harvard undergrad, so we share that, and some Columbia Business School past. She has also evolved from nonprofit and media into very intense corporate finance and tech, and apparel and global strategy, as she'll say a little bit more about. So thank you, Sheema, for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thrilled to be here.
So let's ground and then dive in, which is our normal pattern. 11.5 on inertia. Incredible. So like stuck in like prehistoric cement, maybe not even like cement, not even mud, prehistoric cement. Yeah. And yet things are literally burning and changing so insanely around us, right? I hear that. I was thinking about it for myself this morning, and I was like, zero, like nothing has been the same today to yesterday for the last, well, 100 days, and even more before that, maybe since 2020 or something. And on the other hand, so stuck. I hear that. What, before we ground, Sheema, what would your number be if I asked this of you?
I would say somewhere of a 5, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. Because of Sherry's reason of like it's either 0 or it's 10, and so you're
Yeah, like I
averaging to
feel
five.
like it's so contextual, and that's
Yeah,
also okay. And I think if
yeah,
anything, like these days, the ability to be malleable and react to the current day's context, whether that is the me, we, and the world, sort of to use the 3D alignment metaphor, I think that can look different every day or even within the day.
yeah. Yeah. And yeah, that's well put, Sherry. And thank you, Sheema. I see that. Cool. All right. So, believing in neuroscience and the power of our brains, we start with a little breath and start before that, even with a little movement. Just jiggle or shake out whatever you need to. And then come to comfortable, grounded stillness in your seat. Not a cement stuck groundness, but a dynamic, grounded stillness. Close or avert your eyes from that oxygen stealing blue light screen and breathe. Because one thing that must always be changing if we are literally to remain alive, it is the molecules of air that we breathe in and out. And just check in with that number in this moment, in these 42 moments that we're together. Where is your inertia meter? And how might breath get it more under control? Appreciating the easy, organic rhythm of breath as movement. Take one more deep breath. And then, as you're ready, come back to the group and your screen. Hopefully, a bit more oxygenated, grounded, but unstuck, perhaps. So, as we all probably know, maybe know at this point or not, new moon is really this idea of a re-beginning, right? That one cycle has ended and now it's something new. And as you may know, I'm a little bit of an armchair astrologist, just enough to kind of inform our time together a little bit. And this new moon that was yesterday afternoon on the East Coast was in Taurus, which is this really like practical sign. And so I want to bring that. I love the idea of kind of a practical approach to purpose and impact and, these things that can be kind of airy or aspirational or vague. How do we really bring that down to earth? And so we're going to be thinking about that Taurus grounded energy in the three dimensions of me, we, and world. So I'm just curious. I know there's a lot for you, Sheema, right now, but what are you thinking about starting or unsticking in this moment?
I would say as you know, the last year has been one of a lot of growth and challenge. Last year, I would say I thought my focus was sort of unsticking myself from tying like a lot of my self-worth to my career, which I was sort of conditioned to feel that way. Both as a child of immigrants who sort of achieved the American dream in America, but also I think I came out of the womb kind of like that. Um, so, and I think that in a way transitioned well to the parental loss. My father unexpectedly passed away on New Year's Eve this past year, and that was sort of a wake up call that I obviously had not expected, but had was the strongest change in sort of my orientation towards these variables of my life, whether that's my job, my friends, my family, and like what is the notion of time to me, and like what does that look
Mm,
like in practice and in how I engage with it. And so now that I'm almost 4 months out of what happened, there's been a lot of change. I've learned a lot about myself, and I would say like
mm,
to simply summarize what I would say I'm trying to focus on, it's really being okay with the inertia and anti-inertia, which I know we'll get to in a bit of what life throws at you. And that can look differently in within those variables, whether that's my job, whether that's the way I spend my time with my family, my friends, and things that actually bring me joy,
mm.
like even just reading books, which I found really hard to do until now. I've read three in the last month. So, clearly, if you want to make the time,
Progress.
you can. And so I think maintaining that focus is something that
Mm,
I wanna be able to not only do for myself, but hopefully be able to bring my brother and my mom into the fold in that regard as well.
mm. I love that. And yeah, we talked about that sort of path that diverges in the woods. So let's dive right in there of, that this incredible trauma and loss and grief event of losing your father unexpectedly in a close family after, again, hard years. I think those shocks to our system can logically or understandably push us in either direction, either total freeze mode, right? Or let's change everything else then because everything's up in the air. So say a little more about either or both of those factors that you've been feeling since
Yeah,
January.
absolutely. And I would say, for context, my parents met in Tulsa, Oklahoma while in college. They're both from Iran. And, I was born and raised in Tulsa. My father taught for nearly 40 years. Um, and I would say I was always very close to both of my parents, both independently and collectively. And
Mm,
I was always very frustrated that my father worked so much, but I also understood why he was doing what he was doing. So I could rationalize, all of the decades of work.
mm,
And the day he passed away, that morning, I had brought up the fact that I wanted my parents to really live full time in their new home in California. They were sort of splitting their time between Tulsa and California. And again, my father had really, he essentially was just like, I want to make sure things are tied up with your brother back in Tulsa. And I quite literally just told him bluntly, I was like, we don't need money. We don't need resources. All we want is time with you. All we want is time. And that conversation was probably around 11:30 a.m. that day. And like my dad had the heart attack at around 7. And so for me, the
mm,
shock was obviously there. Like the event itself was extremely traumatic. I think anyone who's trying to like save their dad by CPR for 20 minutes is going to experience some level of trauma. Um, but in a way, I felt like the connective tissue between the conversation I had with my dad and what happened that evening, the fact that I was actually still there, I was supposed to come back to New York that following morning. Um, I actually found myself very grateful.
mm,
And the fact that there was that connective tissue between the conversation I had with him, expressing my frustration of this sort of tying self worth to his job, even though I understood why he was doing it, was to provide for his family, where he
mm,
had to start from quite literally scratch when he started in this country. I could rationalize the decisions he made, but
mm,
I reached a point with him where I was like, well, you've done everything you can. Now it's time to really relish in the fruits of your labor. And so for me, losing my dad in the way that I did, I was like, and not for nothing, it was also the day before his first day of retirement. And so I found it to be like a very poetic departure. And so, as someone, I would say, if you ask anyone in my family, like, I'm very similar to my father in the sense that I was always a workhorse, not necessarily going to be the smartest person in the room, but I can almost guarantee you I'll outwork you. Like, I was that person and I always have been. And losing my dad like that, I was just like, it's really not worth it. Like my dad spent decades trying to achieve this dream of finally buying my mom and his kids this beautiful condo in Long Beach, California, and to finally furnish it and then not being able to experience even one day retirement with the people you did it for was like a real reckoning psychologically for me. And so I would say the first 2 weeks were definitely in like business mode of,
mm,
oh shit, like there's a lot of work to do. Um,
mm,
Even though my father had, set up everything in all the right ways, there's just a lot of work that goes with losing someone and picking up a lot of pieces. And then we were pretty heads down and planning his funeral until the 40th day of mourning, which for us Muslims,
mm,
that's when we do the celebration of life. And so for me, I obviously was experiencing the trauma in isolation of what actually happened, but I think in
mm,
parallel I was experiencing like why were all of these extremely significant connective tissues between what happened, the timing, the fact that I was there, I was with my mom, not for nothing. Again, like the retirement timing, everything just felt like really, and I'm not religious by any means, but everything just felt like I was being told that I need to really take a look at my orientation to life because we always say, time is not guaranteed. Like tomorrow is not guaranteed. And I thought I understood what that meant, but I clearly did not fully understand that at a core level. So I would say that that dichotomy of, yes, there were some ways in which I was kind of full throttle business mode, managing the trust, making sure that we were checking off all the right boxes. But there was this sort of parallel process where I was really taking a step back, and things that would have gotten me uptight or stressed out in the past just were completely wouldn't phase me, and not in a way in the sense that I was numb. It wasn't that I was this actually doesn't really matter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so like the 3D alignment, right? It's not stasis ever. It's this like ongoing juggling. And so I think, this too, it's not that, there's real power in inertia, right? The physical force of an object in motion staying in motion keeps us alive and keeps us breathing and feeding our kids and doing what we need to do. There's magic in that and ease almost. And to use the beautiful example of your dad, that incredible discipline and caretaking and hard work and striving is a beautiful thing. And on the other hand, we got to break the cycle. We got to get out of the inertia. We have to do something different. We have to honor time and the fact that tomorrow isn't given, right? So at this moment, how do you wake up each day and handle that balance?
I would say my biggest fear coming out of what had happened, and I was feeling this way even 2 days after. Like I was still completely in shock, but my biggest fear was that I was going to let what had happened consume my life. That I would fall victim to a narrative where something extremely traumatic happens and someone, their interpersonal relationships fall apart, they can't regulate their emotions, or God forbid they suffer health issues or mental health issues that they hadn't experienced before and that they can't really crawl out of. And that was my biggest fear. And I actually found it odd that that was my biggest fear. I'm like, I gotta figure out a way to get my dad cremated in 10 days from the LA County coroner's office. Like, how is this like equally top of mind for me? And I would say I was split between trying to take care of myself, like making sure I was eating or, getting movement or getting some sun out every day. But I became very comfortable with just allowing some level of inertia take over like my day to day, which I wouldn't say I was someone in the past who was okay with that. I always felt like I needed to be in control. Now I think I'm sort of split between this dichotomy of inertia and this form of anti-inertia, where there's, on one hand, there's this inertia where you're kind of moving with like almost day to day, you're almost robotically going through the motions of life in the office, at home, with your friends, etc. And as someone who I loved my experience in my last job at Authentic Brands Group. I think I realized that I like to have a little bit more diversity in what kind of strategic work I was doing. I realized I could either stay in my current role, continue to grow, continue to build. And that felt like that was essentially sticking to the familiar. And there wasn't anything wrong with that. That said, on the anti-inertia scale, you're talking about at what point is moving with the gravitational forces of life kind of bringing you down putting you in a block of cement in a way, and sticking you to your seat in a way that's actually hindering your own personal growth. It's not always tied to your professional growth. And so I was not necessarily looking to change my life in any way after what happened with my dad. I would say the only thing that I was truly like, wow, no matter what, this is what I'm going to do. I was like, I'm going to get a stress test on my heart every year as an elective procedure just to do it. Because my father, frankly, on his side of the family, there is a pretty serious
Mm.
history of heart attacks. And looking back, I was pretty lucky to have my dad until he was 69 years old.
Uh-huh.
So I'm like, I'm going to get these stress tests done. But other than that, I wasn't really looking to change my life, but I was very open to what
Mm.
possible changes would look like. But I did know that I would not make a change for the sake of making a change, because then
Mm.
that's when you're going down the path of essentially letting what's happened consume your decision making. And I think from a professional sense, that's probably the only thing that has been manifested in this period of time, where I had known the CEO of this big tech company for quite some time. And long story short, he had actually reached out to me on the first business day of 2025, checking in to chat. And of course, I was like, a little busy. Can I get back to you? And I think his reaction to what I told him had happened was really indicative of the kind of leader that I wanted to work with and work for, and what kind of culture I wanted to be a part of. And I essentially was able to very thoughtfully think about my next step. And I'm joining that company in a couple of weeks, and I'm very excited. And I think holding back on making changes last year sort of led to this decision. And of course, like, it happened in the context of this insane tragedy, but I think that's sort of my anti-inertia moment, where, and like, that's okay. Like, it's okay to not necessarily allow the gravitational forces of what's happening in your life to provide an opportunity to not only reallocate some of the mental energy that is probably consumed by what's happened, but also I realize I'm someone who's just motivated by growth and learning and curiosity. And so having something new would have been very good for me. And I don't think I fully appreciated that before any of this happened.
Yeah. When we were chatting, kind of getting ready for this, you said, you said that you're making this change, and I'll put Sheema's LinkedIn so y'all can follow the announcement when it comes shortly, that it's not totally public, which big tech company she'll be joining, making so lucky to have her. And you very immediately kind of said, I know a lot of people wouldn't really advise like a job change so quickly after a trauma like this, and I think you say it so beautifully there, that that's a should, which is another theme that we talk about earlier in the year of, like, why, right? And to your point, we all process so differently, and for some people that might be a horrible idea, but in your case, that growth, that curiosity, that new leaf is exactly what you want and perhaps need here, right? Well, after that kind of 40-day initial phase and all of the administration of death, which is unbelievably overwhelming and complicated when you're going through all the rest of it. So I love that recognition of, okay, that might be an idea out there, or a should, that this is a bad idea, but I actually am really, it's just right. And you mentioned him and that leader, and kind of that leader you want to work for. How did you evaluate this opportunity? Like, so, we've talked about that 3D perspective that you've now come to embrace in your career journey. How did you look at this to tell that there was that alignment?
I think there's a few things. I think one was from a very top level perspective. I had never worked in tech. So I worked at Saks at the beginning of my career, business school, and then I found myself in fashion entertainment. And so tech was essentially the only industry that I had very early on, years ago, indicated that I would like to work in at some point. Like, I found it interesting, I found it fast paced, and I found it relevant to essentially whatever I would be doing in my entire career. So that was always the baseline. I think the other two pieces that I think were critical in my assessment was, one is, it's not really tied to my boss per se. Like, of course that's very important, but I think as someone who started her career at a place like Goldman that has an extremely strong culture, like, everything was always about the firm with a capital F, no matter who was in the CEO and COO seat. And I always found that incredibly compelling, because I do think it intimates a communal understanding of a shared mission that you can't necessarily expect in every company.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like this company that I'll be joining in a couple of weeks, everyone seemed really stoked to be there. The people who had been there for 10 years through multiple acquisitions, the people who
Mm-hmm.
had just started 2 years ago or even a year ago, from the manager level to other C-suite levels. And I found that incredibly significant in
Mm-hmm.
assessing a place where, to your point, is this a good idea for me to jump into something completely new with, frankly, a lot of responsibility?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to take that on, you're going to want to take that on in an environment where you know you can go ask for help or take a shot in the dark or have an idea, and having your boss tell you point blank that he just wants someone with an opinion, which I always do, and who can really be stuck in a room and brainstorm ideas and workshop things. Like that's what I really loved doing. That's why I loved my role at Goldman. That's why I loved the work that I did at Authentic, because I was always trying something new and trying to fit out of the box ideas into what is otherwise like a pretty straightforward landscape, commercially speaking. And then lastly, I would say, as related to my boss, I think I'd be lying if I said his reaction to what had happened in my life didn't play a role. I already knew this person enough where for a long enough period of time where I had a pretty good assessment of him as a person.
Yeah.
But I do think you learn a lot about people in these unfortunate realities that happen. And I think you can't assume that every C-suite leader has a certain amount of empathy. And I think that is one of the hardest attributes to carry when you are leading a 100-person organization to 8,000 to 50,000, you name it. And I think for me, I'd always looked at myself as a businesswoman whose business partners could always say like was fair. Like tough, I'm fine with tough or intense, like that's fine, but I would always want the person signing a deal with me to be able to say like I was a fair negotiator, I was a fair business partner, and I was good to them. And I think that's not necessarily the inherent like foundation of what business is supposed to be. It's very transactional, and there's always going to be some level of winners and some levels of losers, and everyone takes turns filling those roles over and over again. And so I think when you can find a leader that not only you can learn from professionally, like within the confines of the industry or the product that you're selling, but can you learn from them in terms of, is this someone that you want to be similar to or compared to 5 or 10 years now? And I thought that was the case here.
Very cool. Our last conversation was with Christy Smith, who was formerly the CHRO of Accenture. So speak about, 750,000 employees was her remit in that role. But in her new book, she talks about and really helpfully, I think, distinguishes emotional intelligence, which we've talked about for a while now, happily, from emotional maturity. Which I think, is kind of an expanded version of that empathy piece that, yes, it would be great if our leaders are emotionally intelligent, and that's kind of become table stakes, I would say, ish these days. But actually, that's not enough. You can be very emotionally intelligent and still show up as a total jerk, right? And not have a team that is stoked to be there. But that emotional maturity, which enables empathy at a moment like that, where no one is watching, right? That's not an official leadership engagement because he might have been kind of recruiting you in his head, but that wasn't on the table. Nobody was watching, right? And those moments are so powerful. So yeah, no, that's appealing, right? And that speaks to why it's such a good reason, because you get a fabulous high level, senior, hardworking professional like you to jump ship in a moment when you weren't necessarily looking or even felt like you shouldn't go anywhere, right? That's a huge coup.
And to your point, I think, and to Christy's point, the emotional intelligence is being able to go into a room and identify that Sheema is sad or Sheema is stressed. But that maturity you're talking about is saying to yourself, I understand what she's feeling, or I know what type of feeling she's feeling.
Mm.
I think she can grow with this grief in a way because I've known her for long enough, and there's a certain level of understanding there.
Yeah.
I think she can be someone who will, obviously you'll never really get over what
Yeah.
happened, but is this someone who can grow with it, grow
Mm-hmm.
with the grief? And
Mm-hmm.
that's where I think the maturity is. And once you come to that conclusion, your response is where that maturity comes into play. And I
Yeah.
definitely felt that in January. I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't end up really having the conversation with him until after the funeral. So this was probably
Sure.
mid-February. So I
Yeah.
really took my time in terms of making sure that I felt like I was having the conversation when I had my head on a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
straight.
Mm-hmm.
um I think any time before then would have been premature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've alluded to kind of the me piece of both the grief process, but also your career and self journey till now, and then the we, both the professional ambition and the family dynamics. We haven't gotten too much into the world, but say a little bit as you head into this new role from this new mindset and heart place. What are what are your watch outs in the different dimensions? Like where are you really focused, or how are you thinking about alignment in each of those dimensions in this new role?
So I would say, as it relates to me, I think I'm kind of coming into this new role eyes wide open, hearts open, brains open for business, like just ready to learn and absorb as much as possible.
Mm.
And I think one validating point of making the right decision was essentially being told, like, the first few months, like, you need to just learn,
Yeah,
and like that's okay. And
yeah.
then you can start adding value. Um, I think one aspect that I have always struggled with is, to what extent is my job tied to my, not necessarily my values, but do I feel like I'm changing the world, making an impact, etc. And I kind of came to the realization a few years ago that that would have been very challenging to do in a corporate context. And so,
Mm.
like, it's a little bit more of a binary decision there. That said, coming out of my dad's passing, I felt like my dad had an amazing impact on hundreds, thousands of people in the Tulsa metro area. He's taught at Oklahoma's only HBCU for nearly 40 years. He, I mean, the number of emails and phone calls from students he
Mm.
had from
Mhm.
10, 20 years ago was overwhelming in the
Mm.
best way possible.
Mhm.
And for me, it was a shame and he actually inspired he's the reason I ended up at Defy Ventures, because he piloted a second chance program in the state prison in Oklahoma. And he actually, in the later years of his career, that's where he spent most of his time and when he found the most joy.
Yeah.
And so he actually informed my views on incarceration, bail reform, et cetera, et cetera. And it was challenging for me to feel like those programs that he was really devoted to wouldn't continue on after his passing. And so we set up a
Mhm.
donor advised fund with the Tulsa Community Foundation. We raise around $25,000, and basically that's going to be going to organizations like Defy Ventures, going to that specific prison in Oklahoma to make sure that those inmates have the right books, have the latest technology to be able to actually leave prison in a way that's empowering and reduces recidivism. And the reason I bring that up is that I think that that's my way of controlling for the broader we and world
Mm.
component
Mm.
of the decision. Because obviously, me working at a big tech company, unless I were an engineer where I'm working in, there's like the whole AI conversation that I can be a part of, which I'm sure I will be a part of those conversations.
Mhm.
But I think because I'm not a product person per se,
Mhm.
my value and like my orientation there is always going to be different. But I think this way of committing more of my time and energy, of honoring my dad financially to these organizations, to these people who need help, kind of controls for that piece that
Mm.
I felt like was always missing in my career. And then I think the other thing is figuring out a way to understand how I view my role as not necessarily as an employee of a tech company, but my role as a Middle Eastern woman in a fairly senior position at any company. Like, what does that really mean? And I
Mhm.
felt like I had a lot of examples of that earlier in my career, and I didn't realize how informative and how compelling that was for my own
Mm.
world to have examples of those kinds of women while I
Mhm.
was 22 years old as an analyst. And I don't think I understood that responsibility
Mhm.
as critically until now. Or I would say like in the last year or so, maybe two. But I don't think I kind of took that on as a primary role in my job until fairly recently.
Mm. Mm. It's such a eloquent, I hear little bits, and maybe I'm projecting, but I hear this in leaders like you and the 3D community of, an almost apology for my corporate job not healing the world. And my position and invitation is just like, that was the most eloquent description of your 1/8 billionth, right? Which folks here have heard me say of like, you got to separate, right? There's a huge circle of concern for most of us these days. Huge, right? Whether it's global peace or climate change or the rainforest or our kids' careers or our parents aging or our company share, all of that. And then there's this much, much, much smaller circle of influence. And that's not by a lack of ambition or fatalism or whatever. It's just real. It's much smaller. But the problem is, right, this is Stephen Covey, good stuff from the 80s. When we act out here in our circle of concern beyond this small thing, we waste energy, lose credibility, and dilute our impact.
Yeah.
So, hallelujah to that cocktail in so many of your spheres of impact, right? In my nerdy type A, very analytical framework for impact around money for the community and the community and nonprofit volunteering, showing up behind that money, not just donating, and then being a role model in a very tangible way that personally from coming up through corporate, how powerful that is based on your identity that no one else literally can do. And so, of course, that's where you are. And so, and yeah, you're not the product person doing that, but you're enabling the company to thrive. You're helping the strategy. We won't say too much exactly what you're doing, but that's just spot on, full, robust 1/8 billionth in my world. So thank you for putting that out there so clearly.
No, absolutely. And you're right. I definitely found myself apologizing for some of my career, which is funny because if I were to tell 10-year-old Sheema that this was going to be the career that you were going to have, I'd be like, you're off your rocker. I feel that's crazy. There's no way. Like, I like sports and film, and I was a film major at Harvard and a sociology major. I was not a finance major. The fact that I was at Goldman Sachs to this day is kind of insane. I wasn't even a banker there. Like, I was in a strategy role. So the entire nonlinear path still to this day like doesn't make sense on paper, but there has been a common thread. And I've only sort of recently become okay with that, to your point. I think um, all of these dreams that I had of changing the world, etc., one were wildly unrealistic in terms of how I thought they were going to happen. But secondly, I think once I became okay with the nonlinear nature of my skill set and my trajectory, I felt a lot more okay with the fact that I wasn't working in nonprofit, that I wasn't a lawyer who was working on civil rights cases. Like, and I have friends who do that, and I think they're so amazing and
Yeah.
a lot stronger than me as a person. But like,
Mm.
I think for myself, I think I'm where I'm supposed to be.
Mm. Mm.
And I generally have been. I just didn't know it
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah. Here's to that. And here's to, so to wrap and close, I know we're at time. There's that trade-off of the positive power of inertia to keep you going on this path that is yours, right? And not have an existential crisis of I need to blow it all up and go work at a nonprofit or go work at Defy full time or run the donor advised fund in your dad's honor. You gotta keep doing what you're doing. And then the breaking of inertia to change that model of you can absolutely have massive impact and absolutely change lives, whether hundreds of thousands, all like your dad, or several in a smaller way, or hundreds of millions through the tech that you might influence. Um, Not in a nonprofit role, right? That's such a
Right.
sticky old story that we have, especially in the US, I think, or Western capitalism. So beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, community, for being here. A few follow ups. In 3D. My speaker site is live, very eagerly, generously, appreciatively accepting referrals to keynote stages, primarily for purpose seeking leaders, whether that's board directors or executives really across industry, but with that mindset of wanting our work to matter. So that's that. Myself and some colleagues are doing a free series in honor of Mental Health Month, which starts Thursday in May. And so every Thursday from 2:30 to 3:30 Eastern, there will be a fabulous, highly trained speaker offering their piece. None of us are mental health clinicians. And so this is very much about kind of grounded, rooted human support for leaders in the corporate space who recognize that mental health is a major crisis and a major business inhibitor. And so without getting trained as therapists or psychoanalysts, how can we show up and support our people? So those will be some great talks. Mine is on May 22nd. And then Defy, we've talked about a few times. It's really an incredible organization. The May event to volunteer at the Connecticut facility is full. They do have a wait list, and there's virtual and in-person opportunities certainly coming along behind that. So that's a piece that I wrote about the work and what I learned from the women there, with all the links that you would need to get involved or to sign up. So highly recommend them as a lever for world impact. Their stats are amazing. 90% employment rate after release, and something like 25-ish% recidivism versus like 70%. They work nationally, so it changes a little bit region to region, but it's just like an amazing financial ROI for the cost of the program, which is about $2,500 per person, and that reduction in the cost of putting them back in prison. So shout out to Defy. But thank you so much. Thank you, Sherry and Taylor, for your keen attention. It was really fun to have you both here for this. And Sheema, thank you for unapologetically being a massively aligned and impactful leader,
Thank
even
you.
in the wake of trauma.
No, I really appreciate it. It was so great to meet you all.
Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Talk soon.